Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind whispered through the forest, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Eric adjusted the worn strap of his lute as he moved silently beneath the canopy of trees. The sun barely peeked through the thick leaves, casting dappled shadows on the mossy ground. It had been days since he last saw a village, and his rations were nearly gone. But it didn't matter. His mind was elsewhere, chasing the elusive muse of inspiration. As a bard, he lived for moments when melody and emotion intertwined, crafting songs that could stir the heart or calm the soul. Yet as of late, inspiration had been as fleeting as the wind. He hummed softly to himself, an old tune he'd once played in the courts of the Laureate. Back when life was simpler, before he left, before the king, sun had begun stirring unrest among the noble. Back when his songs were for joy, not war, but those times were gone, and perhaps Eric thought bitterly, so was his muse. Just as the thought crossed his mind, the air grew still. The trees, which had been swaying gently moments before, now stood silent as stone. Eric Sand's footsteps slowed, his gaze shifting to the dense thicket ahead. He hadn't seen it earlier, but there, hidden amongst the overgrowth, was the faint outline of a structure, old forgotten, crumbling beneath the weight of centuries. A ruin. Eric Tabaka's curiosity stirred. He had wandered through many forgotten places in his years as a traveling bard, but there was something different about this one. It called to him, tugging at the corners of his consciousness. He pushed through the brush, moving closer until the remnants of an ancient stone doorway came into view. Above it, an inscription was carved into the stone in a language long dead. Eric brushed his fingers against the cold surface, tracing the symbol. "Here lies Ashran," he murmured, translating the ancient script. His heart quickened. Ashran, the blade of legends, the sword that could channel the power of music itself. Eric had heard stories of it whispered in taverns and spoken of by bards long past. It was said that Ashran had the power to turn melody into raw, destructive force. But it was also said that those who wielded it were never the same. For a moment, he hesitated, but the lure of legend was too strong. He stepped through the doorway and into the dark, cold heart of the ruin. The interior was damp and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. Eric's footsteps echoed as he moved deeper into the tomb, his lute slung across his back like a silent companion. The deeper he went, the stronger the pull of Ashran became, like a heartbeat vibrating through the wall. And then he saw it. At the center of the room, nestled atop a stone pedestal, was a sword unlike any Eric had ever seen. Its hilt was wrapped in ancient leather, its blade as black as night save for the faint red veins that pulsed along its edge, as though the metal itself was alive. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he approached. He could hear the faintest hum in the air, a melody dark and haunting calling to him. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal of the hilt. The moment his hand closed around it, the world shifted. He could feel the power within the blade surge through him, coursing through his veins like fire. 1,000 songs filled his mind, each one more powerful than the last. But there was something else too, something darker. He could feel the weight of the sword, so past the destruction it had wrought, the lives it had taken. Eric stumbled back, gasping for breath as he released the blade. But it was too late. The connection had been made. Ashran was his now, whether he wanted it or not. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. Eric stood at the entrance of the ruin, the sword strapped to his back, his lute in hand. The world felt different now, darker, heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sword was watching him, waiting for him to play. For the first time in days, Eric didn't yum as he walked. His thoughts were consumed by the weight of Ashran and the power it promised. But he knew better than to trust it. Power like that always came at a cost. Valoria loomed ahead, its tall spires piercing the sky like jagged teeth. The kingdom was a place of beauty once, its cobbled streets and bustling markets filled with music, art, and laughter. But now it was on the brink of ruin. King Alaric, as health was failing, and with it, the stability of the realm. Whispers of civil war were on every tongue, and two factions had begun to rise, one loyal to the king, son Prince Aldred, and the other to a noble woman named Lady Lyra. Eric hadn't planned to return to the city, but something had drawn him here. Perhaps it was the pull of Ashran, or maybe it was the hope of finding inspiration in the chaos. Either way, he was here now, and it didn't take long for his presence to be noticed. Ardric the Bard, a voice called as he entered the city gate. He turned to see a familiar face, Joran, a fellow bard he had known from his days at court. I thought you'd left Valoria for good. Eric shrugged. Seems I couldn't stay away. Joran's gaze shifted to the sword on Eric's back and his eyes widened. Is that? Yes. Eric cut him off, not wanting to discuss the sword any further. What's going on here? I've heard rumors of unrest. Joran grimaced. Rumors are putting it lightly. The king sighs on his deathbed, and Uldren S. already making moves to claim the throne. But Lady Lyrasen's not having it. She then rallied half the nobles to her side, claiming Aldred's not fit to rule. It's Elmeth and the people caught in the middle, as always. Joran sighed, but Davis started to side with Lyra. She's got away with words, that one. She's been asking after you, actually? Eric frowned at me. Joran nodded. Seems she's heard of your talents, wants you to play for her rebellion, says your music could unite the people. Eric's hand instinctively went to the hilt of Ashrend, the weight of the sword a constant reminder of the power he now held. And what does Aldred want? Joran hesitated. He wants you to, but not for your songs. He's just heard about Ashrend. Of course, he had. Eric's reputation had always been tied to his music, but now it seemed the sword was becoming just as much a part of his legend. And that was dangerous. Eric had no desire to be a pawn in the power struggle between Aldred and Lyra. But the truth was, he couldn't ignore the war brewing around him. I need to think, Eric muttered, brushing past Joran Stacy. That night, Eric sat in the corner of a dimly lit tavern, his lute resting against the table beside him. The tavern was crowded, filled with soldiers, rebels, and townsfolk alike. All of them were tense, their voices low, as they discussed the uncertain future of Valoria. Eric listened, but his mind was elsewhere. His fingers traced the edge of Ashrend's hilt, the sword humming softly in response. He could feel the power within it begging to be unleashed, but he didn't want to play, not yet. Across the room, a figure caught his eye, Lady Lyra. She was as striking as the rumors had said, her auburn hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, her eyes sharp and calculating. She moved through the crowd with grace, a smile here, a word there, every movement deliberate. She was a woman who knew how to command a room, and now she was coming toward him. Eric, she said as she approached, her voice low but steady. I have been looking for you. I've heard, he replied, his gaze never leaving her face. What do you want? Lyra slid into the seat across from him, her eyes flicking briefly to the sword at his side. I want what you can give me. Your music. I am not interested in playing for anyone's eyes war, Eric said flatly. Lyra's expression softened. I am not asking you to play for war. I am asking you to play for peace. The people of Valoria are tired, Eric. Tired of the corruption. Tired of the bloodshed. They need something to believe in. Something to unite them. Your music can be that. Eric wanted to believe her. He really did, but he had seen too much. Heard too many promises broken by those in power. And what about Aldred, who's making the same promises? Isn't he? Lyra's eyes darkened. Aldred doesn't want peace, he wants control. He'll use whatever means necessary to get it, including you. Eric leaned back in his chair, his fingers still resting on Ashrend's hilt, and you won. Lyra held his gaze, her voice soft but firm. I won, because I know what is at stake. The people's future, their hope, it's all in the balance. I am fighting for them, not for myself. Eric studied her for a long moment. She was sincere. That much was clear. But sincerity didn't always win wars, and he wasn't sure if his songs were enough to stop the coming storm. I'll think about it, he said finally. Lyra nodded, standing from her seat. That's all I asked. As she turned to leave, Eric felt the familiar tug of the sword at his side, its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. He could feel the song stirring within him, the notes dark and haunting. Ashrend was calling, and it wouldn't be long before he answered. The next day, Eric left the tavern before dawn, the streets of Valoria still cloaked in a gray mist. He moved quietly through the empty alleys, his mind spinning with conflicting thought. The weight of Ashrend was heavier today, the blade practically humming against his back as though it sensed the tension in the air. Eric's fingers absently traced the hilt, feeling the pulse of energy running through it. He couldn't escape the pull of the sword much longer. The music was building inside him like a storm waiting to break. It was only a matter of time before the notes spilled out, and he had no idea what destruction might follow. Eric, through his feet, carried him to the outskirts of the city, past the merchant district, and beyond the crumbling walls that marked Valoria's old battleground. Here, the signs of civil unrest were everywhere: broken carts abandoned in the streets, houses with their windows smashed, and soldiers patrolling in small, wary groups. Valoria was tearing itself apart, and no song, no matter how beautiful, could mend it. He found a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree and sat, drawing his lute into his lap. His hands moved over the strings, plucking a soft, mournful tune. The melody came to him unbidden, like a forgotten memory, resurfacing after years of neglect. It was not the Song of Ashes, not yet, but it was close. He could feel the dark undertones creeping into the melody, the way the notes threatened to slip into something darker, more dangerous. He closed his eyes, letting the music guide him. For a brief moment, he was just Eric the Bard again, playing for the simple joy of it. But then the melody shifted. His fingers moved faster, the chords deeper, more resonant. The pulse of Ashren grew stronger, syncing with the music. Eric could feel the power in his fingertips, could feel the air around him tremble with the raw force of it. And then the images came. He saw flames rising high above the city walls, consuming everything in their path. He saw bodies, soldiers, townsfolk, all lying in the streets, their faces twisted in agony. And above it all, he heard the Song of Ashes, its haunting refrain echoing through the destruction. Eric, he says, hands stilled on the strings, his breath coming in, ragged gasp. He had barely played a few notes of the song, and already the visions were overpowering. The power of Ashrend was too much. If he unleashed it, there would be no turning back. He would be the bringer of ruin. He stood abruptly, shoving the lute into its case and strapping it to his back. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. He needed to move, needed to get away from the city before the sword consumed him. But as he turned to leave, he found himself face to face with Prince Aldred. The prince stood before him, flanked by a dozen soldiers, all of them clad in the black and gold armor of Valoria's royal guard. Aldred's cold blue eyes swept over Eric, taking in the lute, the sword strapped to his back, and the look of dread etched on his face. "So it's true," Aldred said, his voice as smooth as silk. "The bard carries Ashred." Eric's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the sword, his grip tightening. "What do you want?" Aldred smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "The same thing Lady Lyra wants. Power control? You think she's any different from me, Bard? She used you just like I will." "I am not interested in being used," Eric growled. Aldred took a step closer, his gaze hardening. "You don't have a choice. The kingdom is falling apart, and whoever controls you controls its future. You can stand there and pretend to be neutral, but we both know that that's a lie. You have the power to shape Valoria's destiny, and if you doty choose, I'll make the choice for you." The soldiers behind Aldred shifted, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Eric's pulse quickened. He could feel the tension in the air, could feel the power of Ashren building inside him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it back. "I want to be your weapon," Eric said, his voice low and dangerous. Aldred's smile widened. "You already are." And with that, the prince drew his sword. The soldiers moved in unison, drawing their blades and stepping forward to surround Eric. The prince raised his sword, the steel gleaming in the early morning light, and brought it down in a swift, deadly arc. Instinct took over. Eric's fingers found the strings of his lute, and without thinking, he began to play. The first few notes were soft, almost hesitant, but they quickly grew louder, more forceful. The melody was dark and haunting, the Song of Ashes rising unbidden from deep within him. The air around him shimmered, crackling with raw energy. The soldiers hesitated, their movements slowing as the power of the song washed over them. Eric's fingers moved faster, the notes weaving together into a complex, destructive harmony. And then the world exploded. A wave of fire erupted from the ground, spreading out in a perfect circle around Eric. The flames consumed everything in their path, swallowing the soldiers whole. Their screams were brief, cut off as the fire reduced them to ash in an instant. The ground shook, the trees around him igniting in bursts of flame, their leaves turning to embers that floated in the air like dying stars. Aldred staggered back, his sword falling from his hand as the fire closed in on him. But before it could reach him, Eric stopped playing. The flames died out as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a scorched circle of earth and the charred remains of the royal guard. Aldred stared at Eric, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. What have you done?" Eric says, hands were shaking, his breath coming in, shallow gasp. He could feel the weight of Ashran pressing down on him, the power still pulsing through his veins. He had barely touched the song, and already the destruction was overwhelming. I warned you, Eric said, his voice hollow. I want to be your weapon. Aldred's face twisted in rage, but he didn't move. He couldn't talk. The fear in his eyes was too strong. Without another word, Eric turned and walked away, the blackened earth crunching beneath his boot. The sword was silent now, but Eric knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The song of ashes was growing stronger, and he was losing control. By the time Eric returned to the city, the sun was high in the sky. He moved through the streets with purpose, ignoring the stares of the townsfolk and the whispers that followed him. News of the destruction in the outskirts had already spread. They knew what he had done. They feared him now. But that didn't matter. Eric had made his decision. He found Lady Lyra in the heart of the city, surrounded by her soldiers and advisors. She was speaking with a group of townsfolk when she saw him approach. Her eyes widened and she quickly dismissed the others, stepping forward to meet him. Eric, she said, her voice filled with concern. What happened? I played, Eric said simply. Lyra's gaze shifted to the sword on his back, her expression darkening, and it was worse than I could have imagined. For a moment, there was silence between them. Lyra's eyes searched his face, trying to gauge what he was thinking, what he was feeling, but Eric was too numb to feel anything. What are you going to do? She asked finally. Erica looked past her at the city that stretched out before him. Valoria was on the edge of destruction, teetering between two forces that both claimed to fight for its future, but neither of them truly understood the cost of power. I am going to end this, Eric said quietly. Lyra frowned. Eric's hand tightened around the hilt of Ashran by playing one final song. Lyra's eyes widened in alarm. Eric, you can...
I don't know you.
At our choice, Eric interrupted. The sword. 1T. Stop until I do. I've never seen what it can do, and if I don't finish this now, it'll destroy everything. Lyra reached out, grabbing his arm. You don't have to do this, their son. Another way. There isn't, Erica said, pulling away. Not anymore. Lyra opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a shout echoed through the street. Erica turned to see a group of soldiers pushing their way through the crowd, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. At their head was Prince Aldred. But something was different. Aldred's face was twisted in fury, his eyes burning with a strange, unnatural light. His sword was drawn, and as he moved toward them, Eric could feel the dark energy radiating off of him. You think you can walk away from this, bard? Aldred shouted. You think you can just leave me in the ashes? Lyra's hand went to the hilt of her own sword, her stance tense. Aldred don't do this. Aldred ignored her, his gaze fixed on Eric. You think you can take Valoria from me? You think you can just destroy everything and leave? Eric Michel's hand tightened on Ashran. The power was building again, stronger this time, more insistent. He could feel the song rising in his chest, pushing its way to the surface. I'm not taking anything from you, Eric said quietly. I am saving what's left. Aldred let out a low, bitter laugh. Saving you, that destroyed everything. You think your songs can fix this? You were nothing but a tool, a weapon to be used by those with real power. Eric's gaze hardened. No, Aldred, you were wrong. The real power is in time destruction. It's untrue. With that, Erica raised his lute, his fingers finding the strings with practiced ease. The Song of Ashes was already there, waiting for him. But this time, he didn't let it consume him. This time, he controlled it. The first notes rang out soft and haunting, filling the air with a melody that was both beautiful and tragic. Erica's stiff fingers moved faster, weaving together a song of loss, of pain, of the truth that had been buried beneath the ashes for so long. The power of Ashran surged through him, but instead of fire, it brought revelation. As the song filled the streets, the people of Valoria stopped. The soldiers lowered their weapons, their expressions softening. They saw in Eric's music the truth of what had been lost, the lives, the hope, the future that had been consumed by the greed and ambition of those in power. Even Aldred faltered, his sword lowering as the dark light in his eyes faded. He staggered back, his hand clutching at his chest, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. And then, as the final notes of the song echoed through the streets, Eric let the lute fall silent. The city was still, the war was over. Eric took a deep breath. the weight of Ashrin finally lifting from his shoulder. The sword was silent now, its power spent, and for the first time in a long while, Eric felt at peace.